Ricciardo versus Ocon is becoming a bigger question than most would have imagined headed into the 2020 F1 season. Daniel Ricciardo's fantastic 2020 with Renault has been one of the best stories all season in Formula 1. After flirting with the podium over the last several races, Ricciardo finally found his way back to the top steps in Formula 1 at the Eiffel Grand Prix with a third place finish. While Renault has enjoyed a newfound success behind Ricciardo's performances, there is an awkward reality that he will be leaving the team next season. And their driver who will be with the team in 2021, Esteban Ocon, has struggled to keep up. As a result, Esteban Ocon has come under recent pressure, with many asking the questions of how good is Ocon, and should he keep his seat moving forward. But is Ricciardo really leaving Ocon in a shadow? Let's take a closer look. Ricciardo versus Ocon is becoming a much bigger question in Formula 1 over the last several Grand Prix. Daniel Ricciardo, who is going to be leaving Renault at the end of the season, and his teammate Esteban Ocon have both seen improved performances this season, but Daniel Ricciardo is the driver we're all talking about. He has been fantastic, whereas Esteban Ocon seems to, by comparison, be kind of in the shadows to his teammate, as I said in the intro. What I want to do here, though, is take a look at the 2020 Formula 1 season so far at Renault Racing. Daniel Ricciardo, who will be jumping ship for McLaren next year, and Esteban Ocon, who's going to be stuck with this team in the 2021 season. And the narrative now is, should he have that seat? Is he as good as we all thought that he was coming into the 2020 season? And is there a reason why Esteban Ocon is perceived to be struggling compared to Daniel Ricciardo? And what I really want to do here is take a look is he actually struggling compared to Daniel Ricciardo? Or is it maybe being blown out of proportion just a little bit based on some of the exceeding of expectations that Daniel Ricciardo has done in this ride of this season? So taking a look at the 2020 season, going down all 11 Grand Prix we've had, few notes before we get into it. Daniel Ricciardo has a 10-1 lead over his teammate in qualification. Only one time has Esteban Ocon actually out-qualified Daniel Ricciardo, and he has a 92 lead in finishes. So 9 out of the 11 Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo has found himself ahead of his teammate. Good numbers when you compare yourself to your teammate, not great numbers if you're Esteban Ocon. That said, it does have to be noted that Ocon has had 3 mechanical failure retirements to Daniel Ricciardo's 1, so some of that isn't totally fair, and what I really want to do now is take a look at the closer numbers of what's actually going on here. So starting off in the beginning of the season, I've said this in some of my other videos, Renault in the beginning of the season still looked a little bit average, maybe a little improved from the year before in 2019, but they didn't look fantastic. And when we start off this season, Ricciardo has a mechanical failure to start the year at the Austrian Grand Prix, qualifies 10th. Ocon is over here, qualifies 14th, but he finishes in the points at 8th. Considered a pretty solid day for Renault, kind of where they were last year. That's a good day for where they were last year. Daniel Ricciardo then has a 9th place and 11th place qualifying, back-to-back 8th place finishes. Over here, Ocon has his first of 3 retirements, and has a pretty average day, well, not really average, a below average day of 14th qualifying, 14th finish. But then this is kind of what I want to look at in the middle part of the season so far. Daniel Ricciardo starts flirting with the podium a little bit. When we get to the Great Britain Grand Prix, he qualifies 8th and finishes 4th. And at the same Grand Prix, Ocon doesn't do that badly. He qualifies 9th and finishes 6th. That's a really good day for Renault in general. But because we start seeing Ricciardo flirting with that podium a lot, he starts becoming the story, especially knowing that he's leaving for McLaren. Everyone's kind of focused on him. And I feel like Esteban Ocon kind of floats under the radar. If you watch my power ranking videos, I talk about that a little bit, and I have Ocon in the back end of the top 10 pretty frequently because he's gotten consistently better after what I'd say was a really average to below average start. But he's definitely being overshadowed by what Ricciardo's doing. So when we go through this, Ricciardo's not immune to having some bad days. At the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, he has a 14th place finish after qualifying 5th. And his teammate finishes in the points after starting 11th. So there were some days that Ocon outperformed Ricciardo. But as we get towards the last 4 or 5 Grand Prix, which is why this conversation is starting to be seen on the internet, and we're starting to hear a lot of people talking about, hey, Daniel Ricciardo's doing great, maybe Ocon's a little overrated compared to, what we were thinking going into the season. It's because Daniel Ricciardo, his qualifying has consistently gotten better, especially the last 4 or 5 Grand Prix. 4th, 7th, 8th, 5th, and 6th. So really, really improved qualification compared to the beginning of the season where he was flirting around 10th on average pretty much up until the Spanish Grand Prix. Belgium Grand Prix. So looking at that, but he gets 3 4th-place finishes and a 5th-place finish in there. We started talking about 5-6 weeks ago that Daniel Ricciardo was looking like he was going to grab a podium eventually. And I said it in numerous videos leading into the Eiffel Grand Prix that I said Daniel Ricciardo is going to get a podium. He looked like he was ready to do it. He was right on the cusp of it a few times, lost it towards the end of the race a few times. It was really upsetting, overtaken a few times right towards the end of the Grand Prix, but he was in position. So 4th, and I didn't highlight this one with the red mark, but the 5th, before he finally gets it done last week and hits the podium. And I think the big conversation is starting to happen that Esteban Ocon, meanwhile, when we look at his results, they're not that bad. They really are not. So we got 6th, 8th, a 13th place, but I will say the Spanish Grand Prix was just not really great for Renault in general. Neither one of them finished in the points there. But then he's got a 5th, an 8th, and a 7th. If you look at those without the retirement outliers, Ocon's not doing that badly, but he reminds me a lot here in the last 3 Grand Prix where he's had a retirement, a 7th, and then another retirement of Carlos Sainz at McLaren. So Carlos Sainz's season seems to not be able to get off the ground because he has a retirement, then a good race, then a retirement, then a good race, then a retirement. It's been playing over and over for Carlos a lot at McLaren, and I think that's kind of something's going on here with Esteban Ocon here towards the end of the season. His qualification's a little more erratic than Ricciardo is, and I think that's not helping him either. I mean, he's had some qualifications, 15th, 12th, and 10th, where it hasn't looked quite as good as what Ricciardo's doing over there. But his finishes largely are pretty solidly in the points, and he's starting to creep towards the middle of those points, that 5th, 6th, 7th, pretty consistently here. His problem is retirements right now. And I think when you look over here in the same races, basically Spain on down, Ricciardo's been looking like he was a podium driver. His worst finish is a 6th place, and that's going to definitely put the pressure on your teammate regardless of what you're doing. We see it happen in every single team. But Renault is now a team that we're talking about possibly finishing 3rd overall in the driver standings this year, or in the constructor standings this year. So they're now under the microscope more than they were probably expecting to be going into the season. If you go by the expectations, I think Esteban Ocon's doing just fine. For where Renault was last year, with the improvements, if you go based on expectations leading into the season, I really think he's doing okay. The problem is the expectations and the level have been now raised. Daniel Ricciardo has helped them raise it, but Renault has way outperformed expectations, and you've had other teams underperform, like Ferrari, and honestly, McLaren has struggled over the last 4 or 5 Grand Prix. They're kind of going the opposite way, and we've seen a switch here. Renault's even catching up to Racing Point at this point. I think it's likely that if they keep running the way they're running, that they might actually beat Racing Point to that standing place in the constructor standings. So with the exceeding of expectations now the pressure is actually on Ocon, and he finds himself in a similar, though not as high pressure situation that Alex Albon finds himself in Red Bull. But it's even more awkward, as I said in the intro, that he's being outperformed and kind of outshined by a driver who's not going to be in the team next year. And the driver who's coming in next year is kind of the king of taking over teams and having issues with his teammates in Fernando Alonso, who's going to come in as a champion of the sport and expect to be the top driver there, but that's just going to add pressure to Esteban Ocon. So I think overall, if we take a look at the averages, I don't think he's that far off of Ricciardo, and I think he's doing okay for what the expectations were going into the season. His biggest problem, like I said, is that Renault has exceeded those expectations, and now he's coming under the microscope a little bit. So we look at the averages. Average qualification for Ricciardo, 7.8 to Esteban Ocon's 10th. So a little over 2 grid places in difference there. We look at average finish, 6.7 for Ricciardo, 8.6 for Esteban Ocon. So again, just about 2 grid places of a difference between this. So it's not that bad. When you look at teammates, that's pretty common to only be about 2 spots off each other. But the biggest problem is that Ricciardo is flirting with the podium every week. Even a 6th place finish there, he was in the conversation of, hey, he with a different strategy, with a different move here or there, he might have been able to podium. Basically, in the last, we're back to old school Ricciardo, where he's kind of in the conversation for a podium every week now. And by comparison, Esteban Ocon has not really been in the conversation for a podium even one time this year. The closest I believe he got would have been that 5th place in Belgium. And realistically, when I think about that race, none of us were probably sitting there watching being like, hey, Ocon might get a podium. Whereas with the Ricciardo ones, every week we're like, oh, he might do it this week. And then we're like, he didn't quite get there. So I think that's kind of what's going on here at Renault. I don't think Ocon's really been that bad. He's getting a lot of YouTube videos from other creators out there, but a lot of articles and a lot of people now in the Formula One community are talking about, hey, was Ocon maybe a little overrated to what we were told? You know, he was expected to come in here and be really good. But I honestly think that he came in there and did exactly what was expected of Renault going into this season. I just think that Renault's faster than they thought they were going to be. Other teams are slower, like all the Ferrari-powered unit cars. And let's not forget that if Ferrari was where they were last year, this year, Renault would still be back in like 5th or 6th in the constructor standings. And Daniel Ricciardo's getting a ton out of that car because he's a world-class driver and really might have been battling for championships had he not left Red Bull. And there's a whole other conversation that's being out there of what's it going to look like at McLaren next year because Renault is taking these steps. And he's played a large role in that. So it's a huge loss for kind of driver and team. But maybe a little bit of unfair pressure being placed on Esteban Ocon here. But at the end of the day, that's Formula One. If you want to be one of the 20 best drivers in the world and race in Formula One, you have to know this might happen. And I don't think anyone saw this coming going into 2020. But at the end of the day, Renault's there. They're battling for top 3 in the constructor standings. Ricciardo has a podium and has looked like he might podium at most of the races, and I don't see that stopping. For a driver that has announced he's leaving a team, what a different situation this has been for him compared to what we saw in 2018 when he announced he was leaving Red Bull, and that wasn't quite as nice of a divorce as we're seeing here with him and Renault, which is full credit to Ricciardo and full credit to the entire team at Renault. But Esteban Ocon is kind of the one that's suffering from that a little bit, now being that teammate. So I don't think it's as bad as people are saying around the internet the last couple days, last week or so. They're a lot closer than it looks, but those are tricky words, right? Because also what we look at here is, are you close to winning races? And right now, Ricciardo looks like he grabbed the baton and just running with it, and Ocon kind of seems like he's 4 or 5 miles behind him in that foot race there. So maybe not a fair comparison, 100%. Maybe not totally fair to Ocon, like I said. But like I said, that's Formula One. It's nature of the beast. If you want to be at the top level, this can happen, and your teammate can put pressure on you like that. And if you're Esteban Ocon, you got to focus at the end of this year. The car has the power. He's had some bad luck with those retirements. The car's fast. Figure out a way to get yourself more in that conversation with those 4th place, 5th place finishes like Ricciardo had. And if things go really well, grab yourself a podium too. I also think that's really important for Ocon going into next year because I personally believe that Alonso is going to be a much more difficult teammate to, create your space at your team and stamp your place in it than Ricciardo has been. Ricciardo's a driver we know is leaving, so there's not really that comparison of like, hey, I need to prove myself compared to my teammate. Next year, that's not going to be the case with Alonso there, and if something like this happens with Alonso, Ocon might be in trouble of holding on to that seat long-term at Renault, which I don't want to see. He's only 24 years old. I think he's got a bright future, but let me know what you think in the comments of Ricciardo versus Ocon. Do you think Ricciardo is totally blowing him out of the water here? After seeing some of these numbers, you think it's maybe a little bit closer, and based on the fact that Ricciardo's kind of closer to podiums, it's kind of being maybe amplified the difference there, even though by averages it's only about 2 grid spots for qualifying and finish. Or do you think Ocon maybe should lose his ride and someone else might be a better fit at Renault moving forward? So as always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider giving me a like and subscribe if you just came across this video, and I'll see you in the next one.